If you'll be turning there, we welcome those of you that are visiting with us. We appreciate your presence tonight. We are beginning a new quarter tonight, but not finished with our part of the last quarter. So we've got probably three or four more classes in Hebrews, and then we'll move on to James. And so if you haven't started reading that, please do so. And we will... my suspicion is that hopefully we'll finish either next Wednesday or the Sunday following and then start James. So we won't be too far behind. But chapter 12 tonight, so be turning there. Curtis, do you mind leading us in a prayer this evening? Amen. Thank you, Curtis. Okay, if you go back to chapter 10, everything that really, that we've looked at the end of chapter 10, into chapter 11, and now into chapter 12, really grows out of this admonition, or these several admonitions in chapter 10. Back, first of all, in verses 19 through 23, 24, having boldness to enter into the holiest, draw near to God with a full assurance of faith, hold fast the confession of our hope, consider one another. And as he finishes that particular chapter, of course, he's not making the chapter divisions, but as he kind of brings those thoughts to a conclusion, once again in verse 38, he makes the observation that the justified man will live by his faith. And everything in chapter 11 really kind of harkens back to that idea of the idea that men that God has considered righteous through the ages are men whose lives are marked by their confidence in God, their trust in God, and all of the things that they had done. And once again, to the Hebrew Christians, if whatever they're facing in their life, some kind of social pressure maybe, it does not appear to be physical persecution yet, but that may be coming. But whatever they're facing, their temptation is to lose their confidence in God, possibly to the point of going back to the law of Moses, if their pressures coming from from other Jewish people. And so the writer of Hebrews starts illustrating faith by using all of these great heroes of Jewish history, of Israelite history. And as we mentioned as we started chapter 11, the kind of irony in those illustrations is that if they went back to Judaism, they would be forsaking the example of all of these people whose relationship with God was not because they were Jews, but because they were faithful. And so as we looked at over the last couple of classes, whether you want to go all the way back to Abel, whether you want to move forward to Noah, to Abraham and the patriarchs, to Moses, and then at the very end of the chapter, and I wish we'd have had a little more time to talk about it, these nameless people that God has recognized, even though He doesn't tell us their names, who not only had been victorious in their life, but who had suffered greatly. And that kind of sets up chapter 12, okay? He's still addressing the same thing he said back at the end of chapter 10. You need to draw near. You need to keep your confidence in God. Don't let the circumstances of your life cause you to lose your confidence in God. And look at all these people who've lived by faith. And then you get to chapter 12, therefore. So this is a conclusion. And it really, for the most part, the argument, it runs really to the end of the chapter, although I guess maybe through verse 11 or so is kind of a bit of a natural break. But the section I want to make sure we get through this evening, therefore we also, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. You have not yet resisted to bloodshed, striving against sin, and you have, or have you, forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as to sons. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you're rebuked by him. Whom the Lord loves, he chastens and scourges every son whom he receives. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? If you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate and not sons. Furthermore, we have human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? Indeed, they for a few days chastened us as seemed best to them, but he for our profit, that we may be partakers of his holiness. Now, no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who've been trained by it. The first few verses really belong to chapter 11, because as he mentioned all these different heroes of faith, it kind of builds up to the idea of the ultimate hero of faith, who is Jesus. And the picture that he paints is the picture of whether it is the end of a marathon as the runners come into the Coliseum, to the stadium, or whether it is any number of contests that might involve foot racing or even wrestling or boxing, all of these things that were a part of the Roman games, of the Grecian games. The picture is, here we are, we're running our own race. We're living our lives of faith, just like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and all these people. And all these folks who have gone before us are cheering us on. That's the picture. Here's this great cloud of witnesses. The witness may be they're watching us and they are witnesses to our struggle. It may also address, though, the idea that they are testifying. That's another common concept in regards to those who are witnesses. They are testifying to us as those who've already finished the race and cheering us on that the race is worth finishing. And I'm not sure which of the two is the better idea. Maybe it's a combination of both if you think about both those ideas. I don't know if this is literal or figurative, folks. I really wish I did. It's a neat picture to think that Moses and Noah and Abel and Enoch are watching our lives and they're cheering us on. I think we like that concept. It is a very appealing concept. I don't know that that's true. Personally, I'm not sure that that's the picture that he's painting. I'm thinking more that it's a kind of a figurative thing, that this is the heritage of God's people, that we live lives of faith, that life's not always easy when we're trying to serve the Lord. We have our struggles, we have our opposition, we have those that would cause us to lose our trust in God, and yet we have the testimony and the cheering section, if you would, of all these people that have gone before us. Is that helpful to you to think about? Do you think about it? You know, this is one of those pictures in the Bible, we're all familiar with it. I guess the first 2 or 3 verses of chapter 12 is one of the more familiar sections in Hebrews. But my question is, do we stop and think about, even if this is figurative, what it is that God's trying to say to us here and what kind of difference that makes? You know, on Wednesday night of Bible class, when we're studying it, it's easy to go, oh yeah, we got all these people cheering for us. Wednesday night in Bible class is not when this is really important. I'm not saying it's unimportant. But the real significance is, you know, when you're at work, when you are in some social setting, when you're in your community and you're dealing with other people and the pressure of secularism, of materialism, of all these other isms that are around us, subjectivism, and you find yourself kind of isolated and feeling overwhelmed and all alone this is a picture that needs to pop into our minds. This is where it's practical. And I'm just not sure that we do that. And so you don't have to raise your hand, you don't have to nod your head, but I would ask you again, is this something that you practicalize? And if it's not, let me suggest that this is a really good practice. God doesn't throw this out without significance. His point is we have a heritage. And whether literal or figurative, everybody that's gone before is in some way interested in our faith and in our contest, and they are cheering us on. And that ought to provide some real encouragement to us. Questions, comments? Anybody? Yes, ma'am.
You know, it says that we'll be perfectly happy in heaven. And it looks like you're saying that people up there can look down and see what we're doing. So if we have family that's gone to heaven and they see that we're not living right, that's the thing that I mean.
Yeah, I don't know. That's why I'm saying I don't know if it's literal or figurative. In my mind, it's probably figurative. And I would fall back to the rich man and Lazarus, who are prohibited from any contact. But the reality is, Phyllis, we don't know. God's painting a picture. The Hebrew writer's painting a picture. And he paints a lot of pictures through the book. A little bit later in this chapter, he's going to paint a picture about the people at Mount Sinai and what they were seeing. And so, again, even if it's just figurative, the imagery is intended to be encouraging. And it's imagery that we should grab hold of. Okay? Whether it's real or not, I don't know. And, you know, what people understand after that, if they can look back, are they going to be sad? I don't know. I have no idea. Huh?
He says the angels are there to help us.
They are ministering spirits to God, sent to minister to His people. We don't know how. You know, I tell you, it's real easy to start putting things together that God doesn't put together. And so that's why I say I'm not inclined to think that it's literal, but I'm not there. You know, my dad may be watching. I don't know. There are times when I really hope he's not, okay? You know, so, but that's really not the picture here. The picture is, look at all these people in chapter 11. They are testifying or watching or cheering us on. And so, because we have all these people who have gone before us and run a race like we're running, the admonition is, you know, we need to put aside anything that's going to hinder us. And he uses athletic language, every weight and the sin that easily ensnares us. And the word ensnare carries with it the idea of a garment that wraps around us. And so from an athlete's point of view, weight would be anything you're carrying, anything on your body. There is some evidence to the idea that in the Olympic Games in ancient times, that they competed naked, and that they did so because there was no hindrance to anything. And that if they wore typically robes or something of the effect, the idea of ensnaring or encircling or getting caught up in as we're trying to run, those are the pictures that are painted. These people would have gotten that. And for us, you know, there's a lot of things that ensnare us. Not necessarily sinful things, but some of them can be. And so what he says is, and again, to these Hebrew brethren who are being tempted to quit because things are hard, serving God is hard. What he's saying is that these things that are tempting you, you need to put them aside. If it's social pressure, okay, well, pleasing the person next door to me is not what's going to get me to heaven. What's going to get me to heaven is pleasing God. And I may have to deal with whatever pressure they put on me, but I can't let that beset me. Okay? And so it's not a hard picture to understand. I would really put more emphasis upon the idea of running with endurance. I've always found it interesting in the Bible, you find the words patience and endurance or persistence sometimes used interchangeably. But I've always kind of been inclined to think of endurance as continuing to act through difficulty, and patience more the idea of passively waiting for a circumstance to end. Now, whether or not that's a completely accurate, because those are words that are very often interchangeable. You know, Greek language is not unlike English. They have synonyms, okay? And I'm not a Greek scholar, but I do think the idea of persistence is to continue in the midst of difficulty. And yeah, we all have difficulty. And the question is, do we keep on serving God? Or do we just quit serving God and hope that the circumstance is going to change? But what he says is we need to run with endurance, whatever our race happens to be. Verse 2, and our inspiration is, and here is the ultimate example of faith, added to all those in chapter 11, looking to Jesus. And he describes him as the author and finisher of our faith. And there's a lot of different ways you can define these two terms. Originator is one of the ways that the first term's used. I like the idea of pioneer, or maybe trailblazer, because what you have is the one who is going before and showing the way and clearing the path, and that's really kind of the essence of what that term means. So, what do you see in Jesus? You see someone who really showed us how to live in faith. And then the finisher or perfecter is the one who brings faith to conclusion. Okay, so the question is, how is it that Jesus pioneered for us faith and brought it to a conclusion? Anybody? Okay, why did he live sinlessly, Andrew? Because the essence of life was doing the will of his Father. In Jesus' case, was that easy? As a man, did he have help? Think about that question. Did he have help in his trust in the Father as a man? Did he have some kind of miraculous faith? Huh? Did he have a choice as a man as to whether or not he could serve or not serve his Father? And in that regard, in that regard, Jesus' trust in God was just like what God asks us to do. He just did it better. He is the originator, the trailblazer, the pioneer. You want to see how faith works? Look at his life, okay? Sinless for 33 years, roughly. And that's always fascinated me. It's not the 3 years that we have the record of in regards to Jesus that I find so compelling. It's the other 30 years that we don't know anything about. And we always, I just wonder if Jesus did this, if Jesus did this, if Jesus did this. I tell you what Jesus did every day of his life. He got up and did exactly what God wanted him to do in every circumstance. Whether it had to do in dealing with his parents, with his brothers and sisters who were not fans of his. You see that very early in his ministry. They're almost insulting of Jesus. As a teenager, this is the one that gets me. I mean, as a teenager, he never messed up in regards to dealing with the Romans, dealing with the Jews, and he knew who he was because at 12, he told his parents he needed to be about his father's business. And so every day got up and made this decision. And I don't know what every day of life was like for him except that he obeyed his Father. And he obeyed his Father out of trust. Because this is the life God asked him to lead, and knowing that ultimately where his life was going to lead was to the cross. And so the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him, and I think Andrew or somebody already mentioned the idea of going back home, going back to be with the Father. He makes the point in John chapter 14, 15, 16, in the prayer in there, I think it's 17. Restore to me the glory that I had with you before the world was. He knew where he was going and he knew what he needed to do, but God didn't make him perfect. He chose to be perfect because he knew what was coming. And so He endured the cross. Here is despising laying aside the weight and the sin that besets us. He endured the cross, despising the shame. And by the word despising is an interesting word. When you hear somebody say, I despise it, what concept does that conjure up in your mind? Hate. Yeah, I just hate it. Hate it with a passion. That's probably not the best definition of this term, interestingly enough. The idea is almost... He just set it aside as if it was insignificant. And I find that really interesting. And I've read several dictionaries that offer this concept, that it's almost the idea of dismissing the cross. And we always think, what a horrible experience it was for Jesus to die on the cross. And I have no doubt that it was. I'm not trying to underrate the pain. But when Jesus looked at it, compared to God's will and the joy that was set before him, the idea here is all of the shame that went with that. You know, to the Jews, you were despised of God. To the Romans, you were a common criminal, so despised that you weren't even killed by beheading or some other capital punishment. This was the worst. It was reserved for the worst of prisoners. And it was a shameful thing. And yet to Jesus, it was, I think I read someone who said, probably in our lingo, it would be like, that's just not a big deal. And I think about that and go, really? To be so consumed with God's will that, okay, yeah, I got to do that, but compared with the joy, okay, that's what I got to deal. I'll deal with it. And that's a whole different perspective in my mind that I hadn't really thought about much as many times as I've studied this idea of dismissing the shame is really quite compelling. And so we look at Jesus. He endured the cross. He dismissed the shame. And where is he now? Well, he's mentioned Psalm 110 several times throughout Hebrews, that Jesus is at the right hand of God. And again, this is another reference to that. That what was the joy set before him? He has received the reward. What have we been encouraged to do? What are the Hebrews encouraged to do back in the middle of chapter 10? To do what? Since we have an entry, we are to what? Back in chapter 10. Huh? Draw near. To come to the throne of God. Where's Jesus? He's at the throne of God. Why is he there? Because he ran the race. Because he persisted. Because he didn't lose his faith. And so there's a sense in which we're invited to do the very thing that Jesus has done, to be with Jesus where he is, which has been the admonition really throughout the letter, but especially as you get to chapter 10. Okay? So there's that picture that he paints for us. Does that make sense? It's not a hard picture. Anybody? Questions, comments? Yeah, okay, great. I'm doing a wonderful job. You have absolutely no questions, okay? Verse 3, consider him. And this idea, once again, of consider is to look carefully at. Think about. Consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself. I'd be really interested in knowing what a day in the life of Jesus during the last 3 years of his life was like. I don't think this is limited to the cross, this hostility of sinners against himself. You know, Jesus had some really bad days. In his hometown, they tried to throw him off of a cliff. You remember that? And he passes through them because they are very, very insulted by his preaching. There are other times when the Jews are seeking to kill him. You know, we tend to think of Jesus, he's always hanging out by the seashore somewhere and he's sitting in the grass and everybody's listening to him and life is wonderful. And he's doing these miracles and everybody's... I'm not sure that that's what Jesus' life was really like. You know, the Old Testament portrayal of him, especially Isaiah 53, is a man of sorrows. He was acquainted with grief. And so I think probably we glamorize the day-to-day life of the Lord somewhat. And so the picture is, or the admonition is, you need to think seriously about this man who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become discouraged. Do you ever think God doesn't get what you're going through?
I think sometimes He wants us to, the old saying, pull your bootstraps up, let's go.
Well, that's where he's going with this argument. That's exactly where he's going with this argument. Is
If like an old boss of mine told me one time, he said, it's easy, everybody can do it.
yeah. But I think the temptation is God just doesn't understand what I'm dealing with. Jesus was, I hear people say this about Paul all the time. Paul wasn't married. So Paul didn't really have a perspective on certain parts of life, okay? And then people say, well, Jesus wasn't married either. Who is he to talk about marriage? Given that he created women, I think probably has a pretty good handle on that. But we tend sometimes to forget that God being God understands, and especially Jesus living 33 years on the earth, and during those 30 years, he's interacting with people. He's living life. He's dealing with circumstances. I don't care what it is you're dealing with. Don't ever think that God doesn't understand, that God just doesn't get me. I think that's a fallacy that sometimes we use to, in my own opinion, to excuse our own weakness. It's easy to say, well, I'm just not going to try harder because nobody gets it. And Ed would say that's kind of the easy way out. And he says, unless next time you're discouraged, you need to think about what Jesus dealt with. And then he goes on in verse 4 to offer this little, I don't know that it's necessarily a zinger, but it certainly acts that way. You've not yet resisted to bloodshed. And the word bloodshed there, by the way, is a term that very often would have been used to describe murder. Okay? He's not saying you haven't been persecuted to the point that you've shed blood. What he's saying is you haven't died yet. You haven't been killed for your faith. If this group of people that the Hebrew writer is writing to are people in the vicinity of Jerusalem, at the beginning of the gospel, in the early chapters of Acts, before Saul's conversion, they did see bloodshed. And he mentions earlier, back in chapter 6, that they had proven themselves in the past. I'm still inclined to think that that's who this is written to. Some people think it's written to Jewish people in the city of Rome for various and sundry reasons, who at this point perhaps hadn't dealt with what's coming with Nero and later on with Domitian. That's certainly a possibility. But the point he's making is you're wanting to give up and you're not dead. Nobody's killed you. That's the way we would say that. You haven't put up such a fight against sin that people are killing you yet, are they? And that's in the context of, well, Jesus did. So the next time you get to thinking it's too hard, you need to think about what God asked him to do. And then he moves to verse 5, which I said a minute ago in reference to Ed's comment. That's kind of where God is going with this when he says, you have forgotten, or it can just as easily be read, have you forgotten? Okay? They wouldn't use punctuation marks the way that we do, and so context very often would determine whether or not there's a question, okay, or a statement. Have you forgotten, or you have forgotten the exhortation that speaks to you as sons? And he quotes from Proverbs chapter 3. And the quotation is, my son, do not despise the chastening. And discipline or training is the same concept. In fact, the word is interchangeable. I'm kind of a fan of discipline. But I think we very often translate chastening because in the context, these people are hurting. In their minds, they're hurting. And God's allowing them to hurt in whatever way. And so the reading, my son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you're rebuked by him. Whom the Lord loves, he chastens and scourges. Notice that particular word. Scourges every son whom he receives. The Jewish Christians would have been familiar with this because it's part of the old law, part of Proverbs. And the Hebrew writer would have them to make the application here. Okay? And once again, how often do we really take passages in the Bible and apply them to our circumstances? You know, are you conversant with the Scriptures so much so that in the middle of difficulty you can say, you know, this is just part of the discipline of the Lord, and I need to not disregard it, despise it, as if it's insignificant. What's happening in my life may well be for my good, and but you have to be pretty conversant with the Bible for passages to pop in your head. And I'd ask you that, and once again, you don't have to answer out loud, but you do need to answer for yourself. When I'm struggling with my faith, when circumstances of life are beating me down, whatever your circumstances are, do you think about certain passages that are intended to encourage you? Or does that just reserve for Bible study? I really do worry about our level of biblical, not necessarily application, but knowledge, that we don't spend enough time with the Scriptures to be familiar with all these passages so that they become a part of our lives, that they're more than academic. And that's exactly what the Hebrew writer is doing right here. He's saying, these things that you study from time to time, you know, that Solomon wrote to his children, trying to get them to be wise, you need to understand and see where they apply to you. You need to recognize that, hey, when life's difficult, I need to think of this as the chastening of the Lord. Maybe He's trying to teach me valuable lessons, and that's the point here. Don't be discouraged, he says, when you're rebuked by Him. Some people think that this has to do with, and if you pick up commentaries, you'll run across this thought from time to time, that these people are being punished because of their sins. I don't see anything in this that says God's rebuking them because of their sin. I think their faith is being tested because the Hebrew writers already said, you ought to be full grown and you're a bunch of kids. And maybe you need to see what's happening in your life as God helping you to develop. So let me ask you this question. How is it that difficulty in life, and pick your poison, relationships, finances, health, job circumstance, community circumstance, school circumstance, how is it that difficulty helps train us in regards to our faith?
Every time we go through one of those situations, we stay faithful. It gives us strength to face the next one.
Okay, there is the James 1 concept that the trying or the testing of your faith works patience. Certainly think that that's true. Anybody else? Is that all there is to it? It's just, well, you know, it's hard, so I got through it. Yes, ma'am? I don't know. I don't know that it happens for that reason. I certainly think that that's something that can come from that. Now think of Job for a second. Yeah, well, I'm inclined to think that he was blind for however long he was because Jesus was eventually going to heal him. And so he lived all his life. But that involves the work of Jesus himself. Okay? I'm wanting you to think more in terms of how is it that God allowing us to go through difficulties makes us better? Yes, ma'am. Okay. It certainly is a test of whether or not I'm going to obey God when it seems like obeying God's not getting me anywhere. And so that's exactly true. Anybody else?
Ecclesiastes talks about, God appointing good times and bad times both so that we will not know anything that comes afterwards.
Yeah.
It really did speak to eternity. And so when the times are good, we should be thankful and realize where they come from. In times of suffering, understand it also has a place. Hebrews 5 and 9 or 8, I think Jesus learned, this is the verse that drives me nuts, because Jesus learned that we need to be suffering. So the Savior had a need for obedience through suffering. There's definitely a place for us in suffering. In humility and understanding, and also about authority.
Yeah.
We have a place and we're limited because the Creator is all powerful. We're in the flesh. One of the draws to be free from that, the access to eternity through the blood of Christ, through this cloud of witnesses, to walk right into heaven, to the throne of God, and bow a knee and be there for Him. To get to the point where you're on your face prostrate, we almost have to go through suffering. It's just like the people coming out of Egypt into the promised land, and He told them, look, you're going to live in a house you didn't build, you're going to eat fruit from the trees you didn't plant. And as a consequence of that, you're not going to appreciate who I am and all the things I've done to you. You're going to turn your back on me and disobey me, and there are consequences. So, in the big scope, suffering is a part of all of it.
There's
To
that.
understand who we are as people, our relationship with God, and why it matters, why it's important, why Jesus who He is, the price of the blood and the suffering He went through, so we can connect to that, hold on to that, realize that's a part of our walk too, so we can get there. We don't lose that.
You want to just offer the invitation now, Andy, while you're at it? Because, I mean, all that's true. When you first mentioned Ecclesiastes, this is kind of what I was thinking, in a much shallower pool than Andy is swimming in. What is it that's the main point that God makes to us in Ecclesiastes? That what? Life is what? Yeah, that finding satisfaction in life is vain. How do you learn that lesson? Well, a lot of times you learn that lesson by experience. And that's Solomon's point is, I tried everything. And what I learned was that there's not anything in this life that holds much value for me. Well, I'm going to tell you, suffering teaches us that as well. Because what we learn about life is, man, there's a lot of injustice here. There's a lot of unfairness here. There's a lot of difficulty here. This is not where I want to be. This is not the way life ought to be. This is not, a part of being in the image and likeness of God and living in a world that He created, as Andy pointed out, where we have gardens that we didn't plant and houses we didn't build. I mean, there's a sense in which we're all living in that kind of a world that God has blessed us in. And it ought to be better than this, but it's not better than this. So where do you find hope? Well, you either just become discouraged and despondent because of all the junk in life, or you learn that God has offered something better. There is life beyond under the sun, and suffering brings you to this conclusion that this is not where my hope is. And I think that's a big part of what Ecclesiastes is trying to teach us, and I think it's part of the lesson here. Don't despise difficulty when God allows it, because God's trying to train you, make you stronger, make you appreciate what you have, make you appreciate the difficulties of life. John Tom?
Well, it's a peace of mind. You have a person that's gone through adversity all their life, through drugs, parental issues, people in their family murder, it's really a rough life. And as they go through that, they can deal with more adversity, little adversity.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't bother them as bad.
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine if they had the faith in God, how much more peaceful they would be if they come to that level of faith that God's going to take care of it. It might not work out like I want it, but God's going to take care of it, and there's nothing I can do about it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But it's a peace of mind that you get from all the adversity if your faith in God is where it needs.
Yeah. which is kind of where James goes in James 1. Trying your faith with patience, let patience have its perfect work. Exactly, good point. Woody? Yeah. Well, and he makes this point as you go farther. He uses the father as earthly fathers as an illustration. In verse 6, whom the Lord loves, he chastens and scourges every son whom he receives. I'm thankful personally that my dad just used a belt, not a scourge. But nonetheless, the imagery is very, very powerful because the point is a father punishes a son or a child in order to help that child be trained about what's right and wrong and what's important and authority and all these different concepts. And so the admonition in verse 7 is if you endure chastening, and the idea is not if you put up with it, the idea is if you're having to go through it. If you're enduring chastening, God's dealing with you as a son. Now you want to talk about a challenging thought. Here's a challenging thought when you're in the middle of difficulty in your life to think, you know what this tells me? This tells me that God thinks enough of me that He's trying to help me to grow in my faith. And I know very few people that adopt that kind of perspective when they're having difficulty in their life. Ed, that was the second bell? Okay.
So, I'm not a real smart guy, so, I'll let that be known.
Well, you're sitting next to Andy, though, so.
Well, I'm sort of it's easier to step forward. It can be very difficult to take a step back. Sometimes things, and some people believe things happen for a reason, it is what it is, but taking a step back sometimes you get to the big picture. And, I have a lot of trouble. I like to move forward. It's tough for me to take a step back. But a lot of times I realize, hey, maybe things aren't as bad as they seem, or they're worse than they seem, but they can always get better.
Well, and no matter where you look at it, the admonition here is, you need to think of this from God's perspective, and instead of forsaking faith in the midst of difficulty, consider the possibility that God is allowing you to go through things because He knows you're going to come out stronger. That's what He does with Job, okay? And so we'll pick up those thoughts, or actually, I won't be here Sunday. Andy can pick up with those thoughts. Andy's teaching Sunday, so I'll be in College Station in Bryan. So at any rate, pick up there in verses, where are we? 9, 10, somewhere in that vicinity on Sunday morning. Thanks, guys. Yes? So, I can't hear you. What?